you picked up a copy of the handout, you might have noticed that there's a question, actually more than one question, but this morning, the first question is, what do we mean by this term? Woe. And I don't mean this morning woe in that sense, but W-O-E, as is hopefully on the screen. All right. Woe. I don't know that it's a term we use very often in our common interaction with one another. We sing a few songs that talk about things like sorrow and woe. We sometimes will use this in rare occasion or in certain occasions to describe someone that's going through very difficult, disturbing times when their heart is really troubled. We'll talk about their woe. When you open up your Bible to Matthew chapter 23, we looked at the first 12 verses of this passage, this chapter, last Sunday morning. And know, especially as we have a number of guests with us this morning, you don't somehow have had to have been here last Sunday to get this Sunday. It's kind of a two-parter, but not really. We're just going to look at some more of Matthew 23 together. Same basic topic, but look at some more of what Jesus has to say in Matthew chapter 23. Depending on how you count them and depending on even some version differences, there are 6 to 8 different times in Matthew 23 that Jesus uses this term, woe, W-O-E. He'll say it again and again, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, or woe to you, and then he'll give a descriptor of some behavior or some lack thereof, something that's missing in the audience that he's addressing in Matthew 23. And for Jesus in this context, it is sorrow. There's something disturbing that's happening and that is going to happen to you because of this unless you change. But it's almost with Jesus, as you read through this chapter, there's a mixture of not just sorrow, but you might say there's also some anger mixed in as he uses this term here. It takes on a bit of a different connotation for Jesus as he is really boldly rebuking and as he addresses this, what did we call it last week, this hypocrisy among those that he labels hypocrites, the scribes and the Pharisees. And if you haven't already then, turn with me to Matthew 23. And let's read verses 13 through 15 of Matthew 23. The first 12 verses are somewhat of an introduction to this, where he's mainly addressing or speaking to his disciples about the Pharisees and scribes, about the hypocrites. But now, starting in verse 13, through the rest of this chapter, he turns his attention directly now to these individuals. A word of caution that we mentioned last week that is worthy of repeating. It is not for us to read Matthew 23 with this third-person view where, well, look at those people. And then we could turn our attention around and look around us. I'm not necessarily saying at the person next to you in the pew. I mean, it might be. But look around at these other people in our world and go, look at those people. Look at the hypocrites. And that's not our task with Matthew 23. It's a bit more personal than that. We might just be guilty in doing that of part of Matthew 23. Matthew 23, 13 through 15, reminds us this morning, as we start looking again at this chapter, of a dangerous balance. Let's look quickly at this, and then we'll look at the rest of this chapter in a more overview fashion. He says, but woe, there's the first one, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, and in that word, hypocrites. For you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. We might say today, you slammed the door in their face, right? The entrance into God's kingdom, God's reign, that, of course, has a lot to do with Jesus, for that matter. But he says, when it comes to that, you're cutting people off. Now, part of this is what they were teaching, but part of this is the actual hypocrisy itself. Look at the rest of this. He says, For you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. There's this preventing, this deterrence happening. And then there is, verse 14 is a bit of an issue here as to whether it actually belonged right here in Matthew or 23 or not. It's actually, the basic teaching is found elsewhere in a different gospel account. We don't have time nor place to get into that today. But if you look at the next, in verse 15 of Matthew 23, he says, Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. And whenever Jesus repeats himself like this, he's not being repetitive for its own sake. It's similar, it's akin to when Jesus says, truly, truly. It's for us to pay extra careful attention. For, the rest of this verse says, You travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte. Not that in reality the Pharisees were very evangelistic or really went on missionary journeys. This might be a bit of a hyperbole. Jesus uses hyperboles a lot in his ministry. Might be a bit of an exaggeration here to further prove his point. But he says that when this happens, let's say, he becomes a proselyte, you go and you get a pagan and you turn them into a Jew, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourself. As I read these 2 or 3 verses, I'm reminded of how this is the dangerous balance. That one of the most commonly used, I'm going to go ahead and say excuses this morning, for someone not wanting to be involved in Christianity, or at least not wanting to do so in a formal way, is they'll say, well, they're all a bunch of hypocrites. I don't want to be around them. And I'm not saying this morning that's legitimate. Right? Even if everybody in the whole church was a hypocrite, that doesn't mean I shouldn't do what I am supposed to do. But the reason it's a dangerous balance is because that is a reminder to me, it's a reminder to us, or at least it should be, that how dare I live in such a way that someone, whether it is, you want to call it an excuse, a reason, illegitimate, or whatever, that someone could point to me and use me as a deterrent, or I become a deterrent, rather, from someone being a part of Jesus' kingdom. It's one of the extra problems with hypocrisy. It's the effect it has on other people. Now let's look at these 3 others this morning. We could approach this with that question we did ask last time. We could say, do I fit into this box that Jesus describes here? Here are 3 other ways that he describes hypocrites. The first one is that hypocrites, they rely on loopholes. Loopholes. Did you hear about the fellow that he was nearing the end of his life, and he was found frantically reading through and turning the pages and searching through a copy of the Bible? And a friend of his that had came to visit asked, "What are you doing?" You know what he said? "I'm looking for loopholes. Looking for loopholes." Matthew 23, verse 16. Jesus says, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred?" Might be a smidge of greed that's behind this. He mentions greed later. "And you say," verse 18, "if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, then he's bound by his oath." 19, "You blind men, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred?" Same principle at work. "So, whoever swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it." Verse 21, And whoever swears by the temple swears by it, and by him who dwells in it. And whoever swears, last verse of this paragraph, by heaven swears by the throne of God. And whoever sits, and he who sits upon it. Someone put it this way, that the hypocrite makes a science, or is a great practitioner of the science of evasion. That'd be another way of putting it. They work through loopholes. They find some way to still allow their heart to fulfill itself, even here in their words. They're still dishonoring God. They're still breaking their word. But they find some way to make it sound and look okay. They find this loophole. Well, I won't do that. I'll do this instead. And it's not an ancient problem. There could be a number of ways we might do this today. We could stay with words. We could think of the way that there's certain words that everybody knows that a Christian, you just don't say those words. But then we find other words. We find euphemisms to replace them. Or sometimes, I don't know if it's tradition, I don't know if it's the way the word sounds, or it's like if somebody says hell, and it's not in this context, for instance, reading this passage of Scripture or in reference to a legitimate use, well, that's a bad word. And by the way, I'm not saying you should use that word in that way this morning. Keep going, follow me. But if someone says, good heavens, or oh heavens, well, I mean, that's a pretty decent phrase, right? See where I'm going with this? In that we tend to create these distinctions that are artificial. We just, for whatever reason, by habit or because we use this word, it's okay. And the worldly people use those words. The Pharisees, they say, well, I'm not going to do this I'm not going to say by God, I'll just say by the altar. And it makes it okay. It doesn't. Another passage to keep in mind this morning is Matthew chapter 12. Same book, different chapter, verses 36 and 37, where we're reminded, and I think we could be reminded even here as Jesus writes, that God not only hears what we say, but God knows the intent behind it. Now, Matthew 12 is about the fact that every word matters when it comes to God. Even if it's something we say without really thinking about it, it's careless, depending on your version, a careless word, idle word, I think the English Standard has. It's similar to this thought here in Matthew 23. Being careful. That God hears and God knows. More so even, God knows my heart. So when you go back to Matthew 23, it's that loopholes or trying to find some kind of way around what is right. It only works in our own minds. And it might work for some other people around us, but here's the thing, it never works with God. God sees right through it. I mean, not that God is one to follow loopholes anyway, but we're not, the only person we're even maybe deceiving is ourselves, if even that. Take this specific example. We already mentioned the fact that there might be some greed behind part of this, that they're not going to even talk about the temple, but it's the gold. That's what really mattered to them. That's what was valuable to them. Or the gift, right? Not the altar, as Jesus says. And so the problem behind it is their deceit and lying and greed. And so they're still going to do that, and they find ways to get around it. They rely on loopholes. Is that how I operate? I'm going to do what I want to do, whether it's greed or it's theft or whatever it is that's in my heart. And instead of overcoming that and fighting that, I'm going to find a way to still seem okay in my own mind. I'm going to justify it with some loophole that makes it supposedly okay. That's the first one. They rely on loopholes. But then Secondly, this morning, if we keep reading, the hypocrite also has a disproportionate value system. They have disproportionate values. They value the minuscule, and in so doing, so value that they miss the big picture. Look at the next two verses, Matthew 23, 23 and 24. He writes now, or he says now, and Matthew records it, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, these spices. You tithe of these little things and have neglected the weightier matters of the law." And he gives some of these, like justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. This isn't something that we necessarily have a problem with at all specifically today, but here's how this works. They would be so meticulous about their tithing, of giving really more than 10% when you add it all up, when you look at all the different things they would give of their income, but down to even the spices that most Jews kept a spice garden at this time. And so even these little spices, they make sure they were giving a certain amount of that to the temple, to the priesthood. I guess so the priest could spice their food, right? But that's how careful they were. I mean, these things aren't specifically mentioned in the law of Moses, but they were so cautious and so intense on keeping these little things. They would mark out their spices. And did you see in the second verse of this paragraph, this two-verse paragraph, verse 24, did you catch that crazy illustration Jesus provides us? They would make sure in their water, in their wine, or whatever it was, that they were really careful that a dead insect didn't make it into their cup. They would strain it so carefully. They intentionally designed their strainers that they would catch these small insects, because a dead insect makes your drink unclean, makes you unclean if you drink it. And then he says, you're swallowing a camel. And it's meant to be funny, isn't it? I mean, Jesus, of all things, while he's rebuking them, he makes something that's, if you start thinking about it, it's like Matthew 7 and the plank in your own eye and the speck in your brother's eye. It's a very similar picture in your mind. And a camel, Jesus picks the largest land animal in their land, in Palestine. An animal that is always ritually unclean. So here's an animal that's always unclean, the biggest animal you could look around and see, and Jesus says, you've got that in your glass, and you're swallowing that camel down. But, I better not swallow a dead gnat. Really? And we don't do that one, do we? We don't miss the forest for the trees today. That might be a modern way of putting it. Where I've got to make sure that I've got everything lined up. It might be that I'm the person, I go to church every Sunday. But even when I'm there, I'm in this sour mood. Or I've got somebody that I'm in a fight with, and we're not really on speaking terms. Or I go home Sunday afternoon and my wife says something at lunch I don't like. Or my husband, he must have got up on the wrong side of the bed that morning. We've been at each other all day. And I'm not going to forgive them. But I'm going to be at church. Because that's what God said to do, right? Or it's like I'm going to put my collection in the plate every Sunday. I give to God. While I might be embezzling from my employer. And I'll give a few dollars or maybe $100 or whatever on Sunday compared to thousands. Do we ever do that today? Do we get the details right? where we're an upstanding, church-going citizen, but we don't love our neighbor? What did we sing this morning? Love your neighbor as yourself. Here are the Jews that when Jesus gives somebody their life back, heals somebody on the Sabbath, these Pharisees, what would they do? They look at that and say, oh, he just broke the Sabbath. I mean, he didn't, but according to them he did, because they were so extreme with how they kept the Sabbath law. They added extra laws, and there's no compassion or mercy in their hearts. Now, note with me that Jesus doesn't condemn them for tithing like this and for being careful about the details. The problem with this is not so much the details themselves. It's not the attention and the carefulness with God's law. That's not really the problem. Jesus isn't telling us, don't be careful and don't really care about any of the smaller parts of God's Word. The problem, Jesus says, you should have done both. It might be that we get so extreme with the details that that's part of the reason we miss the bigger things, yes. The problem is with neglecting those larger principles. The problem is when I'm sitting on the pew on Sunday, but by Monday, I'm not even the same person if you were around me in both places. Because I'm getting this part right. I'm crossing my T. But my heart tells a different story. It's like the man or the woman, it could be either one, in their marriage, that if you ask them, are you a good spouse? They say, yeah. And they start listing all the little things they get right. Well, they're not even treating their spouse with kindness and love. Do we ever do that with Jesus? We follow what he says in the small things to the letter. Somehow we miss the big picture. We miss to love God with all our heart. And again, to love our neighbor as ourselves. If you want more insight into what these weightier matters are according to Jesus, you could look at those two that Jesus says everything else hinges or hangs on those two. You get those two right, and part of it is that the little things tend to fall in line after those two big, weighty matters. That's one thing happens. There's a disproportionate values system. Here's the last one this morning. Let's look at this next big paragraph. We will read through this and then we will bring these thoughts to their end. Not only do hypocrites rely on loopholes and have a disproportionate value system or disproportionate values, they also deceive by appearances. This one is a lot like earlier in this chapter when he talked about them doing things for men. So there's some overlap here from earlier in the chapter and even from last week, but there's some nuance at least to this. Look at verse 25 of Matthew 23. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside may also be clean." This is another part of their time where they would debate, the Jews would debate even, is it okay to just clean the outside of the cup and then it's clean, or do you have to clean the inside? This is long before even the understanding of germs and all of that, and bacteria. This was just about ritually, ceremonially cleaning things before you would eat and drink. Which is it? Jesus takes this argument they would have and says, that's what you are. You're like somebody that cleans the outside so that now you're good, but the inside of your cup is filthy. It's dirty and nasty. And the two ones that he mentions here are greed. We might even use the word covetousness. Money is my idol. That's what my life's about. I got to make more money. I got to save the money I make. I got to multiply it. I've got to use it so that someday I can retire and have millions. That's my life goal. And then self-indulgence. And the word that he uses here for self-indulgence, you could think of it this way. It's when I know what's right, but whether it's because it will be uncomfortable, inconvenient, or it will put me in an awkward place. Today it might be politically, it won't align with my politics, or in this situation, it's going to make me look bad. In this context, I don't do it. I know better, but I don't do it. Or it's something that I indulge myself in, I do it, even though I know better, but it feels good to me. Jesus says that's what you really are on the inside. Even though you put on appearances to look good to other people. It's like the person that is there at church. And I've had some experience with individuals who were able to put on a mask and even mask passion for God. I mean, people would say about these people, man, they just love God so much. You can just tell by the way they talk that they're so passionate about evangelism and about worship. But when the person was in the private of their home, profanity after profanity. When the person was at the workplace, someone rubs them the wrong way. What does it we say? They'd let them have a piece of their mind and a little extra. And so on. But to a lot of people looking from the outside, and they're great. But there's a different story. Sometimes there is a different story. Jesus says, on the inside. Look at how he continues. Verse 27. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. I mean, you thought the dirty cup was bad. And this is something else the Jews were really big on, because some of them thought even if your shadow touched a grave, you were unclean. And if you were unclean because of a dead body or a carcass even of an animal, you were unclean for a week. I mean, this was a pretty big deal. And so one thing they would do is they would whitewash and really clean up the tombs and the tombstones, the markers when they did finally bury bones after they took them out of the tombs, just to make extra certain that no one that was walking around would stumble and hit the tomb or walk on the grave. So Jesus takes that and he says, that's what you are. You look really good on the outside. You put on, but it's deception. It's an image-based, not reality-based. On the inside, you were like dead. You're like those graves. They look nice. It's dead on the inside. Keep going with Jesus. He says, so, here's the point. You also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Keep in mind that sometimes we think of the Pharisees as being these people that were so extreme in keeping God's law. And there's some aspects of that, like we said, with the minute details. But Jesus often pointed out that in reality, their problem was not so much they were overzealous for God's law. Like with the loopholes earlier, it was that they really weren't even keeping God's law, period. Their lawlessness on the inside. And then he says this to them. Verses 29 through 37. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, If we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus, you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. And here he's using sons not so much in actual descendant, but in behavior. You're like them. You're the son of. He says, fill up then. And it's a really strange charge from Jesus. It's almost like Jesus is daring them. I dare you. Keep going. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. And then one of the strongest statements from Jesus ever recorded. You serpents, you brood of vipers. The story is that vipers, the brood of vipers are worse than a viper. And you might Google that and see why that's thought. How are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore, I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some of you will flog in your synagogues and persecute them town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Jesus says, you say one thing, and in some cases do one thing. You build tombs and you honor the prophets that your ancestors murdered. You put on this deception, this image of this is who you are. But your hearts tell something else. Empty words and decaying hearts. This is the person who sings loud on Sunday morning, I love Jesus. But the people that live with them know better. This is the person that puts on a smile and greets you when they see you, and they're friendly, and you'd think, man, these people like me, these people are my friends, to your face. But it's almost like the moment that you're out of ear's reach or your back is turned, then they have something different to say to other people about you. We usually call that what? Gossip. I put on an appearance. I'm going to honor and respect this person, or I'm going to do this. I'm this kind of person. Jesus says, go ahead. Do that. Careful. These are some more parts of what it looks like when Jesus says, whoa. Now let's look at the last paragraph, and we'll finish the chapter and we'll finish the sermon. Here's the cure for hypocrisy. We've already noted some things in the past 2 weeks that are a part of the way to overcome hypocrisy. A big part of it is waking up to our own hypocrisy. But note these three things quickly. Verse 37 of Jeremiah. I'm seeing Jerusalem, I think, in my head. Matthew 23, 37 through 39. The first thing I notice is the mercy of Jesus. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. Have you read those stories? I don't know, someone in this room might have actually seen this in person. We have a number of farmers and ranchers where they found a mother hen and she is charred and burned. She's dead. But they pull back her wings and they find baby chicks are alive. There's something about the mercy of Jesus, who will later spread out his arms on a cross, that just might break a hard heart. then he says, we just read that, the last part of verse 37, you were not willing. Part of overcoming hypocrisy is overcoming our own choices to be this way. But then lastly and thirdly this morning, the cure for hypocrisy, if you put it in one statement, it's coming to Jesus. That's what he wants throughout this chapter. I've been wanting you to come to me. Now, for this generation, that doesn't happen. Read the next chapter. But may it be for us this morning that we come to Jesus. I'm not talking necessarily about the invitation song. And we are going to sing an invitation song, and some of you are already getting ready for that. We're going to do that and call you this morning to come, and if you're not a Christian, to be baptized into Jesus. And if you are, there's something you need to make a public awareness of, or just ask for prayer, we can do that. But I'm talking this morning about coming to Jesus daily and laying our hypocrisy and our sins at His feet and saying, woe is me. The Queen Mary, in 1936, she was the largest vessel to ever sail the ocean seas. She made her maiden voyage in 1936. She served for over 4 decades, a world war, all of that. Finally, they retired her, and she was anchored in Long Beach, California, and became a sitting hotel-museum. And as a part of that conversion, they did a lot of reconstruction and restoration, and so they took down the big smoke pipes, the big smokestacks, rather. And they were going to repaint them and all of that. And as they set them on the dock, they crumbled. And they discovered 30 coats of paint. Was all that was left. The 3/4-inch steel that had originally made the smokestacks had rusted away years ago. In Matthew 23, Jesus looks us in the face today and warns us that we get to the end of our lives and we're on the dock of judgment, that we don't crumble because we spent our lives building and painting a picture while we were rusting away on the inside. Let's stand together and sing.